And so just for a brief introduction first, and then they're going to, Tonya Rollins is going to moderate the conversation, and they're going to have a panel type conversation and interactions for about 45 minutes, 40 plus minutes, and then they will open the floor for questions. So to introduce our incredible panelists, Tonya Rollins has worked for the Texas Child Welfare System for 29 years. She's been an investigator, intake specialist, intake supervisor, training specialist, and training manager. She is in her last few days of the Child Protective Services Disproportionality Manager for Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. And she is a very well-known expert on disparities and disproportionality, especially with kids in the system and kids in care. She also teaches at Texas State University in the School of Social Work. Like I said, she's a well-known expert on issues related to poverty, child welfare, race and ethnicity, and disparities in the welfare system. Excuse me, child welfare system. And Dr. Sarah Guidry is the executive director in the, sorry, I was trying to read through her long biography. So Dr. Sarah Guidry is our next person who's going to present. And let's see, I don't want to mess up the name is why I'm pausing, because I said it wrong the first time. The executive director of the Earl Carter Center for Legal and Social Policy at Texas Southern University. I wanted to get that right.
Let me correct it. It is the Earl Carter Institute for Legal and Social Policy at Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University.
Very good. Thank you for doing that. Thanks for jumping in there. She's been an adjunct professor in trial simulation and appellate litigation, and previously the East Texas Regional Managing Attorney for Disability Rights Texas, where she represented disabled persons in various discrimination matters. And in her position, she also provided representation to persons denied health care in Harris County Jail, TYC facilities, and other facilities housing persons with mental disabilities. She's held positions in Department of Family and Protective Services, including supervising attorney of the statewide Special Litigation Unit, which handles complex cases in the agency, the most complex in jury trials and on appeal. Also, she was a special projects attorney, and in that role, she created statewide standardized training and best practice materials for social workers, prosecutors, and judges, and providing legislative analysis to bills that would potentially impact agency litigation. And and she's also very well known throughout the state, publishing a lot of articles and presenting all over the state. And then Judge Aurora Martinez Jones is an associate judge in Travis County. She presides over child welfare dockets, including the Family Drug Treatment Court and Permanent Managing Conservatory dockets, reviewing Travis County cases with foster children in the permanent care of Child Protective Services. And she has dedicated her career to ensuring the most fragile members of the community have fair access to justice. Prior to being appointed as an associate judge, she had her own practice, the Martinez Jones Law Firm, and she's practiced child welfare law, personal injury, probate, real estate, family law, and civil litigation. So I will turn it over to Tonya now and start our incredible panel on service equity and the foster care system.
And I'll give one little update. I did get a promotion by my community and was elected as a district court judge and sworn in January. So now I am a state district court judge.
Yes, I am in the presence of greatness this morning, and I have been given the honor and pleasure to moderate this panel. And as Jen said, please put your questions in the chat feature. We want to be able to answer your questions as well as the questions that I'm going to pose of our panelists. So to start with, we just heard your bios, the ongoing work, the great vast work that you've done in the area of equity. So I have to ask, what brings you to the table and what keeps you at the table?
I'm gonna defer to Her Honor to start the conversation.
Sure. I became a lawyer first and foremost to help people. And I really wanted to help people that didn't normally have a voice in the system or a seat at the table. I'm biracial and first generation American. And so growing up as a child of immigrants, I saw what it could look like if you don't understand a system and you're trying to move throughout your time in the world that speaks a different language that you may not understand. And so it really has been in my heart to want to help my community, to help people who don't normally get that voice elevated. And that's what brought me to law and also children. Children do not often get a voice in kind of anything, especially matters about them. And that's led me into the area of child welfare. And as I've looked at the disparities and I've looked at the inequities and the systemic barriers that I think need to be brought down for justice to truly occur, that has kept me here in this work and moving forward.
So actually next month, it will be 32 years since I handled my first CPS case as a law student in a children's rights clinic at the University of Texas. And I was determined when I got to the University of Texas that I was going to be a business law attorney, specifically doing tax law. And I did that clinic the summer of 1989, and my life changed. And I bonded with the children. I bonded and understood some of the things that were happening with the parents. And when I graduated, I earned, actually, my job was actually paying half of what I had previously earned before I went to law school. But I was doing the work that I wanted to do. So I went to legal aid and I received their CPS docket. And so I've represented children, I've represented parents, I've worked with judges and prosecutors on best practices. And the thing that has kept me there is what I saw back then in terms of how everyone functions in that system is what I'm still seeing. And so what has kept me there is I've tried to make changes by representing children and making services to them better, representing parents and making the services to them better, and also going inside of CPS and trying to change by doing the statewide training. And then coming to TSU, I created our Juvenile Justice Project. And one of the first things that became apparent was when I went to court with foster kids who had been in a lot of trouble, is that the caseworker didn't want to be there. The foster parent didn't want to be there. Many times they had enough with the child. And still trying to make some headway there and protecting kids who are the subject of both of those systems.
Right, thank you.
I say one thing, Ms. Guidry, I also did the Children's Rights Clinic and it changed my life too at the University of Texas School of Law. So I find that as a common thread, really interesting and exciting to see how those kinds of experiences for young legal minds can really mold the work that we do into the future.
Wow. And I'm always amazed at how many people doing equity work come from or have participated in the Children's Rights Clinic at UT. And yes, folks, y'all heard an Aggie acknowledge the University of Texas, just so y'all know. So what Dr. Guidry just said really brings us into our next question, right? Which is, we often hear about this school to prison pipeline, but we don't hear about the foster care to prison pipeline. And I have to say, the first time I heard the term foster care to prison pipeline was at the Earl Carl Institute symposium a few years back. And it really struck me that even within our system, we're not talking about this. So can the two of you guys talk to us about this foster care to prison pipeline?
Sure. I'll start by just throwing out a few numbers. Children who have been foster youth are 59% more likely to be arrested for a juvenile case. They're 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult. They're 30% more likely to commit a violent crime. Nationwide, about 50%, only about 50% of foster children actually graduate from high school. 25% of them experience homelessness, which again impacts educational attainment and leads to that school to prison pipeline. 60%, and this is nationwide, 60% are sex trafficking victims. They're being victimized and also criminalized. And part of the reason that contributes to that is so many kids who age out of the foster care system with no stable placement. And 25% of kids who come out of foster care suffer from traumatic stress disorder or other mental illnesses. And they don't have those supports that they need. There's not enough mental health support in this country anyway. But this particular population is even, as at a greater disadvantage. So we see, because of the numerous placements, because abuse and neglect impacts the child's ability too, in terms of cognitive abilities. The foster care system just is not built. And I said this to you, Tanya, the other day. The state does not make a good parent. And so you have all of these areas coming together and combining and sending these kids from foster homes to schools that aren't equipped to deal with them and deal with the issues that they're dealing with. And then those schools are using the criminal justice system, and they are using the school discipline system to remove these kids from class, which decreases their educational attainment, which increases their health disparities and impacts their whole lives. And that's what we call the foster care to prison pipeline. It's being part of that system, which is not great. In 2015, the federal courts even found that Texas violated the constitutional rights of children in their care. It's not a good system. But when you combine that with the disproportionality in terms of school discipline and the criminalization, the over-criminalization of Black children in particular by schools for child adolescent behavior, then you get the foster care to prison pipeline.
And there are systemic things put in place that continue to perpetuate this. Right now, it is not a secret, and if you don't know, I hope you know now that we are in a placement crisis. We don't have all of the children who need to be in a safe, stable home that can meet all their needs in those placements, and they're sleeping at CPS offices. And when we have those situations, we are setting up even more opportunity for this kind of pipeline to occur. We are putting caseworkers in situations that they were not trained for, that they didn't sign up for, but by statute, they have to be involved with. And when something doesn't go well, because we have kids who have suffered trauma, who need mental health stability, and are in a CPS office with a caseworker just trying to make sure everybody really stays alive day to day, we're not supporting those children's needs. And when things go bad, law enforcement is called. And that's when we create another possibility of putting children into the juvenile justice system, or again, another systemic problem in our state of Texas. If they're 17 years old, that's the adult system. And so I can have a juvenile who is a minor, who is in the care of the state, being referred to the adult criminal justice system at 17 years old. And it's very confusing, and it doesn't make sense how in one system they're an adult, in another system they're still a minor and can't make decisions for themselves. And so we put kids in these situations at no fault of their own because of things that have happened to them, because of the trauma that they've experienced. And we continue to perpetuate this pipeline to the criminal justice system. The disproportionality is also extraordinary. So we are looking at our children of color who are ending up in this pipeline more often than not. In my community, I also preside over a dual status docket. So it's children both in the child welfare system and in the juvenile justice system. And in this moment, I don't have any white children in this dual status, which is amazing because I have white children in my population in my community, and that's for sure. And so we have to look at what are the other systemic reasons that we're seeing these outcomes, because it's not right and it's not just.
You would think after a year I would have gotten a hold of this mute thing, right? Which is very interesting. So I'm hearing so much, and it's not blowing my mind because I know the information. But even hearing the two of you say it, it's still, I'm not even sure what the phrase is. I'm going to use it still makes me feel a certain kind of way, right? As some of the younger folks will say, it makes you feel a certain kind of way. So I have a couple of questions for you. So one, Judge Martinez Jones, in your community, which is a predominantly white community when we look at the numbers, what goes through your mind in terms of processing when you're having a dual status docket with no white children on it? Because we know white children commit offenses, like that's just plain logic.
Well, I start looking at the data and I say, where are my kids coming from? And I see the neighborhoods that they're coming from, which are very particular neighborhoods that for other systemic and racist reasons in my community, is where our families of color reside. And so I see that starkly in my dual status youth. And then I start looking at the different ways in which they're coming into each system. So it kind of doubles and magnifies whenever you're talking about a dual status program, because I have to say on the child welfare side, what's causing them to come in? And then on the juvenile justice side, what's causing them to come in? Both systems disproportionately bring in children of color. And so when we look at the intersecting of those two systems, that's all I'm seeing. I think that there is more work that needs to be done in studying in my community why it is that I could have an opportunity where there are no white children in my dual status program. I think that we have some motivation on our juvenile justice side to not want to allow children to go further down the juvenile justice system, which I can appreciate, and we do a lot of deferred. But I'm wondering which kids are not even getting charged. And whenever I start having hearings and having the children who are in these situations without placement and learning more about what's going on, I'm also seeing that some of our same players in the child welfare side are impacting the disproportionality on the juvenile justice side. And for me in my community, primarily that's law enforcement. And so an example, I've had a case where I had a young kid of color coming in on a juvenile justice case, going into the dual status program. And I'm hearing that law enforcement had 2 youth to look at as far as who may have been arrested, and that even the child welfare worker anticipated the other child would have been the one arrested who was a white child, but law enforcement did not arrest the white child. They arrested the African-American child. And the caseworker felt that that was not right and that was unjust. But my concern was that caseworker did not advocate that. They did not advocate it and allowed it to perpetuate until we get into a hearing. And it's 2 hearings later that they say, well, Judge, it wasn't us who was being, systemically inequitable or racist or disproportionate. It was law enforcement. And I said, this is the 2nd time we've come here on this case, and you've never told me that. You can advocate, again, just as Ms. Guidry said, the state is not a good parent. You would advocate for your own child if you saw something unjust like that go down, but that didn't happen for this child who was in the care of the state. And that's where I say we have to look at our children differently and truly believe them to be our children and advocate for them that way. Because even those caseworkers who may think that it wasn't their decision that caused this disproportionate outcome, they could have advocated for something different.
Thank you. Dr. Guidry, did you want to add anything at all to that?
I was just interested, and Judge, you know, here in Harris County, dual status youth tend to stay in detention longer than other youth because of placement issue. But I was wondering if you've seen different things in other areas of the state as strategies for improving those situations and getting adequate placements.
Well, that's what we're hoping to see moving forward, because we are kind of in this crisis moment. In my community, what ends up happening is, you know, our juvenile justice system really advocates for those kids to get out of detention. I think we've done a lot of work to say detention is not a placement. It just isn't. But when we end up with those youth going back into CPS offices and being without placement, they bounce back and forth. Detention, CPS office, detention, CPS office. And so we can't get the kind of stability to really find out what the underlying causes are of trauma that manifest into the behaviors that continue to have, you know, a new detention. So what we're really working on is trying to figure out how do we infuse that stability early on and fast. And so we're trying to bring in some community partners. We're trying to work with our local mental health authorities and our community health and human services so that we can figure that out. And the other option, quite honestly, I'm trying to keep kids at home. What can I do for mom and dad so that we can wrap them in supports and keep these kids at home? Because at this point, I have to take that factor of a child without placement into consideration when I'm assessing whether or not I remove a child is actually a good idea. And I hate that that's a factor in my judicial decision making, but it is. And if the idea is that this child's going to be removed and only go to a CPS office, and I'm hearing that that may be just another opportunity for them to go into this criminal justice system, I might not order it. And so we're in a really tough place, but we're trying to get that community wraparound services, keep kids at home early and fast if we can.
Wow.
I would just say one of the things that they're working on here in Harris County is they create a community reinvestment fund. And the idea is that service providers who are in these African-American communities, where most of the juveniles come into the system and who are used to working in those communities, would be the people who would receive the funding to create placements for those kids close to home, with a better sense of their culture, their life and societal issues, and so that hopefully we can do a better job. Our goal here is for our detention population, which averages about 140 during the virus, which 100 to 140 during the virus, which was a significant decrease. But our goal, at least my goal, as I participate in these stakeholder groups, is to get detention down to 0.
I hear an audience, what I hope you're hearing is two things. I hope you're hearing that there are problems, there are significant issues and problems, but I'm also hearing that you have communities trying to provide solutions, right? And specifically, people who recognize their voice, trying to come up with solutions. And I heard two other things that I really want to make sure that, two things for you to write down. One, CPS is not a good parent. That is true. And then detention is not a placement. Detention is detention. And that we have to work on both of those issues. So now, as we keep talking about this foster care to prison pipeline, I'm gonna go a little deeper. We have been talking about the criminalization of our youth in care. In this session, there were amendments put to bills to further criminalize youth in care. What are your thoughts on this?
I can't wait till the session is over.
It'll just come back.
No, I mean, one of the big things is unintended consequences. I think there are some legislators out there, some of our lawmakers who have a really good intention. They have a good heart. They want to help. But it takes a lot of us who are experts in the field to help educate our lawmakers about some of the language that they use, some of the ideas that they have, and what the consequences of those changes will actually look like, because I think that that's what happens the most. When we have bills that come through and we talk about legislative intent, once they start going into effect, you know, it's really one thing, but how my lawyers advocate in my courtroom and what really it looks like when I start reading what I can and cannot do, what must and must not happen, sometimes we end up causing more harm than good. And I often think in child welfare, a little like the doctors who have that Hippocratic oath, I am trying to do no more harm in a child welfare case. And it is extraordinarily difficult when we do have laws that come through that have these unintended consequences. Because if we look at a potential for an amendment that would, you know, enhance to a felony this injuries to caseworkers, and we think about in practice what's really happening. And the statistics are it's more child on child injuries and assaults that are occurring when these children are without placement. And we're looking at, you know, supervision issues. It isn't as often that we have a child on adult. So one, is this necessary? And two, if it does occur, in what situation are we anticipating this is happening? This is when something is going down, when a child is without placement at a CPS office, trauma responses are kicking in. And so is the answer to enhance to a felony for this child who has this trauma response and how they're engaging with somebody in an environment that is not supportive of their needs, is that the way we go? And I don't think it is. I think that's how we cause more harm. And so there are other things we could be spending our time doing to improve the laws as opposed to enhancing to felonies this issue. I do not want any caseworker hurt, but I do not think caseworkers need to be put in that position. So there are other things we can do to help support our caseworkers and to support our youth that doesn't involve criminalization.
I think we need to be more progressive as a state. And just looking back when I first started at CPS, is when the laws came into place that you had to have your final order in a year with a possible 6-month extension. I've seen all the federal laws that have been implemented, and now the Family First Act. But we've done a lot of things, but from my perspective, just in terms of longevity, we haven't done the things that really are necessary to. So let me back up. When we did the 12 months and you had to get a final order, what I saw was cases that went from temporary management conservatorship, and I shared with Tonya that I had my case that probably was the longest had been pending for 12 years. There were a number of cases when the law changed that I had that were between 5 and 10 years. And I went across the state doing that. But what we did was we changed from having kids up front to having a lot of kids in the back and permanent management conservatorship. Then we made other changes. And you know, like increasing the ability of the foster parent to be able to get conservatorship of the child or be able to adopt the child. We were behind the 8 ball on that when it comes to children of color. And I have testified before state legislatures here in Texas that there are so many statistics that show that children of color are better off in a kinship placement. They receive less mental health services. They have better educational attainment. They have a better sense of self-identity. I can't remember the name of the professor, but there's a professor who wrote a book about it. And it took all of these changes for us to finally recognize that maybe we should have been looking at family members who aren't perfect, and that might at least put some continuity in terms of the child's life. And so I'm glad we're getting there, but I think it's like the judge said, we've been just reacting. We've been working inside a box. It's time to think outside the box. And I think the best thing that's happening right now is we are having people who are engaging, who have actually been a part of the system. And they're telling us some different things that really matter to the kids who are involved in foster care. And I think one of the participants said that they were foster youth and now MSW and an attorney. Those youth, they need to be leading the conversation and telling us what's happening with them. And I'll share one more story. I heard a young man speak at a conference, and he was a foster youth. He actually came to, lived most of his life in a residential treatment. He came to Texas Southern University and graduated here and enrolled in a master's program. And he was speaking at this conference. And he told us that, his ad litem did come to visit him on a regular basis, check and see how he was doing. She always asked, is anything unusual happening? Anything you need to talk to me about? And he said, I would always say no. I was being sexually assaulted on a regular basis, but that wasn't unusual. So sometimes we're talking in two different languages. And that's why we need to be listening to the people who it's really all about.
I like that. Talking in two different languages. And what is it? How do we get on the same page to talking the same language, as well as going deeper and understanding that my normal, and I often talk about for people of color, there is a normal. For our sexual abuse survivors, there is a normal. For our child abuse survivors. And so us talking about out of the normal, I think that is a great example of the system not using the same language or not speaking the same language. So it's amazing how quickly time flies, but I want to keep us going. There's this whole issue of the adultification bias, and specifically the criminalization of Black girls. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
I'll jump in. The Earl Carl Institute started our Black Girls Initiative about maybe about 3 years ago. And the initiative was based on a publication from Georgetown Law. I think the name is Girl Interrupted. It's part of your materials. But it talked about the adultification of the Black girl and the stereotypes that they face. And as I started looking into it, I was just amazed at how Black girls are overrepresented in so many different systems. And I was also amazed at how difficult it was to get that data. We have a certain amount of transparency now for Black boys because that's been the focus. But I would go to websites of agencies and pull down data sets. And in many cases, I had to make information requests, specific information requests, because I could find a data set for young Black men, but not Black girls. And so we looked at homelessness, we looked at foster care, we looked at school discipline, we looked at family, pregnancy, those kinds of things. One of the things that was really striking that I did not know is that Black girls are charged with more status offenses than anybody, including Black boys. And a status offense is a crime only because of the child's age. So like curfew violations, truancy, those kinds of things. And then we looked into it further and I found the Georgetown report. And it was because Black girls are considered more adult-like and less innocent. And so Black girls get disciplined or criminalized because they're perceived as being belligerent, You've seen the stereotype with Black girls shaking their head. They're seen as being over sexual, which explains when you start looking at the data on human trafficking and you start looking at the data on prostitution charges for kids from 14 to 17 here in Texas. A lot of that has to do with that they're seen as being grown up and they're seen as being not innocent and so free for all in terms of sexual comments. You probably have seen it. Young girls, 12, 13, 14 years old, their anatomy being discussed. There's also the mammy. One of the things we found out is that the perception is that because of this adultification, is that you can take care of everybody and everything. And you don't feel pain at the same level as other races. So it was shocking to me to find out that they did some studies of hospitals and other health institutions. And Black women with the same symptoms and Hispanic too, to a lesser extent, they receive less pain treatment and medication from doctors than somebody similarly situated who is white because of that perception, that adultification and the mammy syndrome that you can take anything. And we have what we call our roundtables where we have discussions with these young girls. And when the pandemic hit, they were talking about they didn't want to miss school. We get back to the school to prison, foster care to prison pipeline. Many of them had to because they had to take care of their siblings. And that's not understood. And so again, they get criminalized. So it's a vicious cycle based on this perception that a Black girl starting at age 5 is twice as adult as their white counterpart, and it increases up to 14%. And this has some horrible ramifications.
I'll say we have I feel lucky to be in the community that I'm in. When that report came out, that study looking at that, I know Tonya brought it to my attention, and I brought it to the attention of one of our other colleagues doing grassroots work in our community who founded an organization called Measure. And so Ms. Mimi Stiles, who founded that, which is an organization who looks at community-based data gathering and analysis. And it is Black data related to Black issues. And so they looked at this adultification bias for Black girls, and they put on a series to educate our community about this huge problem and for the community to come up with solutions on how we can combat it. And I feel very lucky that we had that opportunity in our community. I wish they had more funding to go even wider and bigger with that kind of education, but we did bring their presentation to the attention of our organizations that we have working in the child welfare system, and invited them and brought them in to do their presentation to educate the people in the child welfare system in my community to make sure that they understood what is out there and what is going on and why we're seeing some of these outcomes for especially our Black girls. And I think that it's something that needs to continue, and we have to deepen our understanding of this and absolutely put into place strategies and practices to combat this adultification bias. I think that, as we talked about earlier, speaking different languages, that's not trauma informed, right? And so we talk about the trends that we have of being really trauma informed courts and trauma informed services. We have to speak the same language, which means we have to understand it. And we have to understand what's going on, especially with the youth who are experiencing these outcomes and the impacts of these things like adultification bias. And so it requires us all opening our minds and being educated on it, and then for us to hold each other accountable to changing it.
And it requires having a discussion about racial trauma as part of that trauma conversation, because you can't talk about adultification bias without talking about racism and race and the construct of race, and therefore the racial trauma on top of the additional traumas that children in care have as well. So Well, there's a
That's-
question for you.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question. So there's a question about my comment that I made about legislators and unintended consequences, and whether I think that they innocently cause collateral damage, or do they pass legislation that they know is going to adversely affect foster children, but they just don't care, in comparison to some voting legislation that adversely affects the voting public. I want to be very clear. I'm talking specifically related to child welfare issues, right? We are in a highly politicized time and in a state that is very partisan. The idea generally is that child welfare issues should not be partisan, that there is room for all parties to care about children. But I know that it does get impacted by partisan politics, which is unfortunate. But what I saw at the legislature, especially this session, was legislation being moved by the voices of constituents. And so the constituents who can speak the loudest and who are more willing to go down to the granite building, regardless of any concerns for public health, perhaps, especially at the beginning of the session, their voices were elevated. Their voices were heard louder. And unfortunately, we were not in a place that I think was just enough to make sure that accessibility to the legislation, the legislators, was just for all populations, right? Because we were still in the middle of a pandemic, and some people cannot put themselves in public spaces, but their voices are just as important. And so politics played into child welfare this session for sure. I think oftentimes it does, but I think that it is one of the issues that has room for bipartisan support for good laws. And I think that we have the opportunity to help our lawmakers get there, but it requires us to be actively involved in the process and educating and advocating for those good laws, especially if it can be done in a bipartisan way.
What's really interesting is I'm glad you answered that question, but also in talking about legislation, when you said the voices of those, I'm going to say those with the privilege to go down and sit at the Capitol all day, waiting to be heard on multiple days. But also, I think you also have to think about the fact that when it comes to certain issues, voter suppression, criminal justice, and so forth, those are more elevated issues. And so the amount of people who are willing to testify, like Dr. Guidry, like Judge Martinez Jones, like some of our other stakeholders who are willing to go down and have their voices heard, those voices are minimal as compared to the voices when it comes to other issues. So one of the things I would say is we have to be able to increase the number of people willing to go downtown. I'm in Austin, so I'm gonna say downtown, to go downtown and have their voices heard. So that when Dr. Guidry is testifying to the legislature, or when Judge Martinez Jones is testifying to the legislature on a voice regarding child welfare, there's a long line of people behind them waiting to testify. I have hope that one day when some of these bills come across, just like on the abortion bills, the criminal justice bills, the voter suppression bills, they'll have to stay there till 3 a.m. to hear from people who are upset about child welfare too. So I'm looking at the time and it's just amazing. See, I just got that little message, Tonya, 15 minutes left.
Can I say one thing before we move on?
Yes.
I have been telling the legislature for the last 10 years that we need police reform if we're going to have reforms that improve prevention and child protective services. Because we are still dealing with the historical racism that impacts Black people and that makes us not want to talk to authority of any kind. And so right now, when we're in this moment, I would encourage everyone. All of this is tied together. And if we're going to be able to reach more African-American parents and work with them and provide services, we're going to have to get the trust of the African-American community in this country. And I won't go any further because I know where I
I was waiting. Thank you. So as we wrap up, both of you come from two different communities. Houston, most diverse community in the state of Texas. Austin, the so-called most progressive community in the state of Texas. What are the greatest barriers to receiving racial equities in these two communities?
Well, I can
Because we
say
haven't got there, but what's the greatest
what
barriers?
you just said is one of the biggest barriers. Austin, one of the most progressive communities in Texas, because we feel that that is what we are, which lends a lot of people to put their head in the sand, to be acknowledged and confronted with the reality and what the data shows us, which is that we are not. Travis County has the worst outcomes for disproportionality for African-American children in the child welfare system. They're removed at a higher rate statewide in Travis County. And because we have this idea of ourselves, we are less willing to work on the problem. It's like saying we don't have a problem, so we're not going to work on a problem, but the data shows us something different. So I would say that's one of our biggest barriers.
So we're doing a little better. We had the Black Girl Magic in 2018, and so our juvenile judges they're rocking and rolling. Things are much better, but I think what we suffered from for a long time, the biggest barrier was confirmation bias. We talk a lot about implicit bias and cognitive bias, but what really traps a lot of people when you get the judicial system involved is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias also traps investigators. You know, it's the adultification thing. If a Black person responds a certain way, you have, your stereotypes, and it just, anything that you see or hear that reinforces that becomes confirmation bias. And the same thing happens with judges, confirmation bias. So before I blew wave, I'm going to tell you, there was clear confirmation bias in our juvenile CPS courts that white foster parents were better for Black children to be adopted with than their own relatives. And so barriers were put in place in many of the courts in terms of allowing relatives to have contact, to just, even conversations and keep kids together because of the thought that the perception that kids are better in a certain type of economic environment. And I like to tell people, I bet you nobody wanted to be Chelsea Clinton when they found out what her father had done. But how many of us have lived in the White House, right? So it's and that's the fight that I've been having since I first started doing these cases. Economic wealth does not necessarily equal best interest, and we forget that.
Yes. So we have 10 minutes left. Please send any questions in. And as we go through the questions, Jen, panelists, I know you guys have been looking at the chat. Are there any outstanding questions? And then I'm going to ask the panelists, where do we go from here? What is our next step? Where are we going?
Well, I know where I would like to go, and I think you have an idea too, Tonya, but I am ready for a court community partnership to keep children out of foster care. I'm looking at supports to invest in our community organizations, those grassroots organizations, to provide culturally responsive services that support families and are elevating the needs and the voice of the family. I want to focus and center on family decision-making tools to make sure that we're not just providing what we think we prescribe to them, because that's our standard of what they should be doing, but that we're actually helping the families with what they know that they need. And so I'm working on that now. I'm hoping to maybe get some grant funding to support that. And with that, I'm looking at a position within my court to have a director of community engagement and equity. Travis County, we do not have an equity office. Our city does, but the county doesn't. And that makes me a little disheartened because I think it's something that would be really helpful. But as a elected official and in my office, I would like to have a director who helps with that, so that as a system, knowing that I'm a part of the system as a judge, I can be held accountable and we can be mindfully doing this work.
And I agree with everything that the judge said. I also think it's important that we internalize these things and that we speak them. The last set of judges, I was at a meeting and one of them said that disproportionality and disparity is BS. And those are the kind of people that need to get off of the bench. We need to get people who can do individualized assessment, making decisions about what's going to happen with these families, whether it's in the CPS system or the court system, and start looking at them one person at a time. As an attorney, probably 95% of the time when I start talking to a client, I know what the result is going to be and what they're going to need and probably why they did whatever they did. But there's always 5% that's different. And sometimes we forget about that. And we get so used to the same services, same people you have to speak to. One thing I hate is 6 months. There's 6 months for everything. If you get charged with a crime, you go on probation for 6 months. You go to counseling for 6 months. We have to get away from that kind of thinking process and actually look at the individual needs. And I think we've come a long way in terms of looking at the effect of trauma. We need to try to continue that type of broader perspective in terms of how we deliver services.
And I'm seeing some questions. I want to touch on a couple of things. So there's a lot of questions about workers, burnout, childcare, what kind of advocacy could occur right now. You know, I would say a couple of things. I think we have to reimagine how things look for families and for the system, right? So in my vision, it's these community organizations who help support the work of our caseworkers. So it's not all depending on a caseworker to check on a family. But if the community is involved and we're taking care of each other, then we can assure that there are safe situations while children can remain in their communities and in their homes. And we're providing the kinds of supports that these families need. I absolutely believe that, you know, caseworkers should be paid more. I think our rates for our providers should be increased. The placement crisis, that was a question, and what can be done. Personally, what I think we need is treatment foster homes and an ability to pay those treatment foster homes for the times in which they are not fostering, so that we don't burn out those treatment foster homes as well. So if there's an opportunity where maybe a family needs respite, or if even bio family needs respite, right? And they don't have the extended family to help them, I would love to be able to utilize a professionally trained foster home for a short-term placement, right? And not have to do a removal. Of course, that requires some changes in ways that we think about this. I would love for foster families to be supplements to bio families and extended family, and work together as a community and not see it as a systemic divide where you either with family relatives or you're with foster. But I feel like that's the heart that a lot of foster families have. And if we give them the training that they need, and especially helping children that need a lot of stability for their mental health, that would be a wonderful partnership we could look at with foster families, bio families, and relatives, and support kids in their needs. So as an advocate, I would say figuring out how you can get that message across, that's where we should invest and be able to help support the families that are going through the system and really do. We have children that have substantial mental health needs, and I don't think that our state is yet equipped to handle all of those. So we've really got to figure that out and work together.
It's very interesting because I want to take a moment with that question to speak to you from someone who was a caseworker. Who started my career as a caseworker. I truly believe that if we reimagine the system, if we take care of the systemic issues that Dr. Guidry and Judge Martinez Jones have been talking about this morning, you will then begin to minimize the amount of burnout. And I talked to you from someone who was burnt out, who left direct delivery because of burnout. I didn't leave the system. I left direct delivery. But if we change the system, because child welfare across this nation, it's become like this sort of given. We talked about the norm and what's abnormal. In child welfare, we talk about caseworker burnout, like, it's one of those things, it's part of the system. Caseworkers are going to get burned out. If we reimagine the system and we start making a system where the system works for children and families, it's going to start working for everybody else in that system. And so I really believe, we often assume things, but if we do what Dr. Guidry and Judge Martinez Jones are talking about, we change the systems and stop accepting that there are just some collateral damage to bad systems. So as we got 3 minutes, any other questions in the Q&A box that stand out? Oh, there's a question about, what about your lawyers who, I missed it, it was up here, who are not in child welfare or criminal justice? I think that was the
yeah, what can
question.
judges who are not in family or criminal justice do to help? Was it that one?
Yes.
I mean, I guess it depends what those judges are doing, but being a voice, convening the community. I mean, as judges, we are able to really have a leadership role in our community, and bringing this issue to the attention of the community and to our system to make sure that we're doing our best to support them. So judicial leadership is huge, but bringing the voices to the table is what I like to use my judicial leadership to do. If I convene people, they come, and then I bring and elevate the voices of the community that need to be heard.
We have 2 minutes. Panelists, any final words?
I always believed in prevention. And so I'm going to say we need to work harder towards prevention. Get those elected officials to spend more time on prevention rather than how the mechanics in the courtroom work. And that includes putting money in these communities. We have so many cases that involve neglect. That should not be an issue in this country. There needs to be money put in those kinds of practices. You got to find the communities where most of these kids come from. Many of them have food deserts. And so they're spending their money at double the rate than some of us are in these other neighborhoods. They're hungry. They're stealing. We need to invest in communities and stop putting money into all these other programs, because prevention is, to me, always the alternative and the avenue. And like, we made a decision here in Harris County, thanks to our current county judge, Judge Hidalgo, is they were about to build a multi-million-dollar new detention facility here in Harris County. And she came on board and she said, we're not going to put money in a building. We're going to put money on these kids, get to the core issues of racism, and look at prevention. And so I would encourage everyone to make that your focus, and that you speak to your communities, your elected officials, your wonderful judges, and let's continue this work.
Agreed.
All right. Thank you. Thank you
Well,
guys
I
for
have to
joining
interrupt
us.
really quickly because we have to all give a really giant round of applause for these amazing panelists, and I'm sure we could listen all day. So thank you very much. I wanted to finish up though by thanking Tonya Rollins. It makes me want to cry. Tonya has absolutely changed lives in our communities across the state. And this is her very last event as a DFPS employee for the state before she moves on to different opportunities. And so we'll have the other two absolutely in their roles for the time being and hopefully indefinitely. But Tonya will disappear a little bit from our forums because she's going to pursue other opportunities. And we're so grateful for Tonya. She absolutely has made all of our worlds a better place.
Thank you very much. And this was the event, being in the presence of greatness, to end my DFPS career with. but let it be no mistake, I'm still doing the work. And as Dr. Guidry said, the work still needs to be done. I just won't be doing it in the forefront, but I'm still going to be doing the work.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.